Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome to this book launch of Dr. Federica Coluzzi's Dante Beyond Influence, Rethinking Reception in Victorian Literary Culture. My name is Darrell O'Connell, and I'm the director of the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland and the head of the Department of Italian here at UCC. And this is, I suppose, a particularly pleasing moment for us here in the centre and the department, because essentially Federica is one of our own, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome her back to Cork. Federica was an IRC postdoctoral fellow here at UCC, and she came to us after completing her PhD at the University of Manchester under the supervision of Guida Armstrong and Daniela Caselli. And she was indeed an excellent addition to our department. We've been very fortunate both as a centre and as a department to attract some of the very best early career academics around. As you know, the primary focus for the Centre for Dante Studies here in UCC has been to kind of create a space for research excellence, for early career people, and bridge that kind of difficult gap between PhD completion and academic posts or other senior research positions. And we've been lucky to attract some really, really great scholars, from Martina Piperno and David Bowe to more recent arrivals like Valentina Mele and Leila Liveraghi, who have all contributed wonderfully to creating this research space. At the center of this was Federica also, who came here on a one-year postdoc with the objective of transforming her thesis into a book. And today we are here to celebrate that book. Sadly for us, Federica had to cut her stay with us very short due to the COVID emergency and has not been back in Cork since March 2020. So I'm delighted to welcome her back 2 years later with this wonderful volume actually completed. And it really is a marvelous achievement, especially given the circumstances that you had to face. We're very proud of you, and we wish you and the book every success. Now, as you know, Federica is now a Lever Hume Early Career Research Fellow at the University of Warwick. And in the intervening period, she's also completed a great number of things above and beyond numerous publications. She has also completed, co-edited with Jacob Blakesley, the volume The Afterlife of Dante'S Vita Nova in the Anglophone World, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Translation and Reception History for the Routledge Studies in Literary Translation series. And this will be published in a couple of months' time. In addition, she has also co-edited, along with our own David Bowe, a special interdisciplinary issue of Italian Studies with the title Mediating Dante. And this issue is also imminent. But today we're here to talk about Dante Beyond Influence. Now, before handing over to our guest, Professor Nick Habley, I'd just like to say a couple of things about the book. This is truly wonderful, and I think it's a very original book, both in its subject matter and in its methodological approach, using the time frame of the later 19th century, here understood from the period 1865 to 1921, and the dawn of modernism. It provides a first kind of systematic inquiry into the formation of the mostly British critical and scholarly discourse on Dante. It seeks to historicize and conceptualize the hermeneutic turn in British reception history. Thus, if you like, moving away from the kind of predominance of literary influence and influences around intertextuality. And this reception history then is seen as the product of a kind of major transformation in Victorian intellectual, social, and publishing history. Federica provides the reader with 5 case studies to unpack what she calls the phenomenology of Victorian Dantismo. And there's also kind of a much needed examination in this book of material culture, which is fascinating, here in the form of kind of newly discovered a body of kind of manuscript and print sources. Victorian medially and writerly engagement with Dante and intertextuality is viewed through the prism through this prism and shown to be deeply sophisticated. It charts this sophistication through prominent periodicals and Victorian mass publishing practices. Indeed, when Federica first applied to the Irish Research Council to come and study here in Ireland, this is one of the kind of fascinating aspects of her work which really drew me to the project. This charting points to an ever-increasing specialization of the scholarly discourse and the academization, if you like, of Dante studies in both university and other kind of intellectual learner societies and settings. The volume draws on those kind of relatively new disciplines of book history and the history of reading. And a way of doing this is, I think, not only convincing, and it is intellectually sound. Figures such as Matthew Arnold, William Gladstone, and I think most notably Christina Rossetti, and quite a few others come under her consideration. And she argues, and I think also quite successfully, that these are major figures in Dante's reception history, and also they are critics of extraordinary originality. One aspect of this work, which is particularly important, I think, is that it demonstrates how the wider socio-cultural and economic impact that the Victorian humanistic turn had in advancing women's access to literary and scholarly professions, educational reform, and also discipline formation. Federica's work concludes with a kind of future gauntlet thrown down to others coming in her wake. And as a kind of way of just wrapping up what I'm going to say, I just want to read the final 2 paragraphs from this work, because I think they really are excellent. Libraries and publishers' archives still hold more than one single book may explore. Much remains to be said in regard to the effect flow of books and sales, the publishers' exchanges with authors, as well as their commissioning of original works, reprints, and new editions. Broadening the geographical borders of the book, a further project would engage in a transcultural discourse in which the history and dynamics of the British 19th century scholarly reception were contrastively compared with their North American and Irish contemporary counterparts, examining the practices, forms, and venues employed for constructing and creating Dantean knowledge. Similarly, these would need to reconsider to what extent the Victorian scholarly endeavour influenced the modernist literary, critical, and scholarly reception of Dante, and whether this continuity would be traceable in the reading practices of modernist readers of Dante. Present and future projects share a common foundational intent, that of offering more nuanced representation of what Daniele Peselli describes as the ubiquitous presence of Dante in 19th and 20th century literary culture. A presence that resonates not only in the verses and the words of poets and novelists, but also echoes in the works of men and women critics, translators, and scholars, and which can be unearthed by following the material traces of their humanistic practices. I think there's a wonderful summation of this quite extraordinary work. So I can't really do this work justice, and for that we have called on the services of Professor Nick Haveley. Nick, as you all know, is a Professor Emeritus at the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York, where he taught from 1971 to 2011. His published work on the Italian Trecento poetry began with translations of the volume of translations, Chaucer's Boccaccio, Sources for Troilus, and the Knights Franklin's Tales from 1980. And this is followed by a number of articles and chapters on Dante and the reception of Dante. And we think of 1998's Dante's Modern Afterlife, Reception and Response from Blake to Heaney, and the monograph Dante and the Franciscans, Poverty and the Papacy in the Commedia from 2004, which was awarded an AHRC research grant. In 2007 and 2008, he was awarded a Liebkühn Research Fellowship for work leading to the wonderful monograph, and Federica has it right here in front of me, Dante's British public. Readers and texts from the 14th century to the present. That was Oxford University Press, 2014, and it was reissued in 2017, which deals with a wide range of writing, criticism, translation, polemic, journals, letters, annotations, catalogues, collections, etc., and reflecting the presence of and conversation about Dante in Britain over the course of nearly 7 centuries. And he continues to publish extensively on Dante in some really, really important volumes. And just really in the last year and a bit, he's co-edited 2 really excellent volumes. Number 1, After Dante, Poets in Purgatory, and he did this alongside our own Cork poet, Bernard O'Donoghue. We like to claim him as one of our own. And then lastly, most recently, Dante Beyond Borders, Context and Reception. This is published by Ligonier in 2022. So Nick, I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks, very much, Dara. I don't think you should have spent so long on going through my career, because we're really here to praise and to celebrate Federica's. But it's very good to see you again, and also to see several old friends as part of this event. Sorry not to be in Cork myself, but I'm very much looking forward to visiting next year for the Dante lecture series. Okay, on what's designed to be a celebratory occasion, rightly so, I have to begin on a somewhat inappropriate note of regret. I first encountered Federica about a decade ago as a highly promising researcher from La Sapienza, and she inquired about possible PhD supervision at my own university, York. But as I was about to retire from York at the time, I regrettably couldn't make an offer to supervise. But of course, then Gaida Armstrong and Dania Caselli at Manchester gave Federica's project much better support than I would have been able to provide, and subsequently UCC and Warwick have done very well by her, as Dara has explained, whilst both the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland and Manchester University Press can clearly claim a lot of credit for helping to develop the project and for publishing Dante Beyond Influence. Just to continue briefly on a personal note, luckily in recent years, I've been able to make some amends for not being available to help earlier with Federica's research, because she and Jacob Blakesley kindly invited me several years ago to contribute to another project, their very interesting forthcoming collection of essays for Routledge on the English life of the Vita Nuova. Since then, our paths have crossed very productively in several interesting contexts. The work on translation, those translations of the Vita Nuova, Federica's learned note on the history of the Oxford Dante Society, which is included in the recent collection of essays on Dante Beyond Borders that Dara has referred to, and last year, a virtual meeting of Piero Boitani's Great Dante Seminar at the Fondazione Sapegno in Morgex, as well as more recently, indeed, only last week, collaboration on yet another joint venture. We were in the panel on 19th century translations of the Commedia for the Notre Dame and Leeds project on English language translations. Okay, now to turn to the issue of reception and to the location of Federica's book within it, landmarks of Dante reception study in Britain are, as Federica recognizes in her introduction, they include the monumental survey by Paget Toynbee of 1909, and pointing in that wider European direction, Michael Caesar's magisterial 1989 Critical Heritage Anthology, whilst certain key critical studies of influence through the 19th century have been those by Steve Ellis in Dante and English Poetry, and with a wider contextual framework, Alison Milbank's Dante and the Victorians. Federica has been kind enough to place my own definition of public alongside Toynbee's comprehensive idea of literature at, quote, the heart of Dante Beyond Influence, although I'm not at all certain that Dante's British public really deserves to be placed tra cotanto senno. What is, I think, certain is that Dante Beyond Influence breaks genuinely new ground by, as the review of its scope in Federica's conclusion puts it, going well beyond the realm of creative appropriation and into the wider dimension of interpretive criticism and academic scholarship, by addressing the phenomenology of Victorian Dantismo within a broader socio-cultural context than that of productive reception, and by redirecting attention, quote, onto agents, forms, and materials of critical and scholarly reception that has so far been largely marginalized from mainstream discourse. The quest for such agents, forms, and materials, of course, will lead deep, as has led deep into the musty perfumes of the archives. As a born-again archivist myself, I found the most productive way of tracing those significant texts and readers of Dante was to widen the net as far as possible and pester the innocent but highly accommodating custodians of special collections from Manchester to Mumbai and from Berlin to Cape Town. But as Federica's list of manuscripts and archives indicates, her approach has been rather more tightly focused, investigating, for example, significant but unpublished correspondence, such as the correspondence between Maria Francesca Rossetti and Longfellow, also the records of several British Dante societies, London, Manchester, Oxford, and the outlines of various extension lectures and continuing education courses. And this targeted archival research very substantially supports a number of the key concerns of Dante Beyond Influence, the ways in which that late 19th century, quote, hermeneutic turn in Dante's studies, in British Dante studies, bred both specialization and popularization. The academic, commercial, and educational projects of the period, and the wider networks of Victorian Dantisti and Dantiste. The developments of those networks is one of the many suggestive features of Dante Beyond Influence, demonstrating the relationships between creative appropriation, private study. It gives due attention to some of the familiar names of 19th century British Dante reception, such as Percy Shelley, Samuel Coleridge, Ugo Foscolo, Thomas Carlyle, George Eliot, William Gladstone, and Matthew Arnold. As Arnold's correspondence, for instance, suggests, those eminent Victorians were always energetically crossing paths and, so to speak, leaving their umbrellas at each other's clubs. Federica also gives a much more in-depth account of the connections and projects of less well-known but important figures who are beginning to attract more attention, such as Philip Wicksteed, the Unitarian minister and the prime mover of the Temple Classics Dante, and Maria Francesca Rossetti, who is rightly described by Federica as, quote, one of the first and the greatest of Victorian women Dantiste. Also illuminating, and for me tantalizingly suggestive, is Federica's assembly here of those many but less familiar Victorian women Dantiste, whose reading, scholarly and divulgative work doubtless relates to her ongoing larger Leverhulme-funded project on Dante's female transnational public in Ireland, Britain, and Italy. Here, as she acknowledges, a context has been mapped by surveys such as Women's Scholarship and Criticism, 1790 to 1900, and by Anne Lawrence's investigations of women popularizers of Dante in the later part of the 19th century, whilst even Dante's British public gives attention to some Victorian women readers such as Frances Kemble and scholars such as Isabella MacLeod. Federica's cast of female characters, however, is more numerous, more fully rounded, and more closely related to the main themes of this late 19th century drama. It includes figures of whom I had not taken account before, but who made significant contributions to the widening receptive circle. For instance, there was Mrs. Paul Chapman, who was appointed to teach the Oxford Extension programme, quote, for lectures in schools only, but who nonetheless treated those school children to 3 different Dante courses and accompanied them with lantern slides of the Botticelli illustrations. And I'll just have a little bit more to add about lantern slides in a while. There was also, in a similar line of work, Catherine M. Filimore, author of Dante at Ravenna, 1898, and other works on Dante in Italian literature, who also lectured to the London Dante Society. I find those interconnections in the Victorian Dante plot thicken considerably here, since that Catherine Filimore was the eldest daughter of the lawyer Robert Filimore, who was one of William Gladstone's oldest friends. And moreover, back in 1839, Filimore had presented to Gladstone's wife, perhaps as a wedding present, the pocket edition of the Commedia, whose subsequent annotations by Gladstone have provided, both for me and for Federica, one of the most striking examples of Victorian reading practice. I'm aware of the limitations on time, but to take just one more impressive feature of Federica's book, orality as a mode of Dante reception is a somewhat neglected or even devalued area, but one that is very well worth investigation, as Dante Beyond Influence shows. As well as the pioneering work of John Ahern and Peter Armour on the early oral reception of the Commedia, there is, for instance, the brilliant account of modern Dante recitation and declamation by Rino Caputo in Amilcare Iannucci's book on Dante cinema and TV. And in a very sketchy recent essay on orality and voicing the Commedia, I suggested that there may be more to be learned about the context and impact of public readings and recitations, and that the effects of lecturing and the lectura dantis tradition might also be explored more fully in relation to orality. Yet, here again, I find that Federica has more or less simultaneously done that very thing and provided ample evidence not only about significant women lecturers, such as Catherine Filimore, Pearl Craigie, and Eleanor Frances Jourdain, but also in a key section which she calls Preaching Dante, there is a passage of brilliant and thought-provoking analysis in which Federica addresses the Unitarian minister and educator Philip Wicksteed's cycle of 6 influential sermons on Dante. Those sermons were delivered in London and Croydon during the autumn of 1878 and were published still, as Federica notes, quote, bearing evident traces of orality in the following year. They would perhaps act as a kind of prelude to the popularizing project of the Temple Classics. And those sermons did indeed, meanwhile, serve to place Dante, I quote again from Federica, in the hands of this new public of readers. I could, as they say, go on, illustrating what I've learned and may soon indeed purloin from this book. For example, the focus on how Wicksteed's Dante preaching made the Purgatorio touch upon the hearer's or reader's everyday life, and the striking passage she quotes, which illustrates that emphasis on what Wicksteed called the nearness of the Purgatorio. I could also enumerate more of the ways in which Dante Beyond influence breaks new ground and fills in the gaps in our understanding and knowledge of Dante reception in this period. But for now, I'll simply conclude by saying that as well as responding so effectively to the need for more evidence and analysis on topics such as reading practices, networks of reception, women's scholarship, popularization, Federica also manages to map out yet further directions for future investigation, as indeed Dara has quoted, such as the evidence about circulation that could be recovered from the archives of libraries and publishers, the transnational dimensions of the subject, which of course she's going on to explore in the current project, and the extent to which, quote, the Victorian scholarly endeavour influenced the modernist literary, critical and scholarly reception of Dante. One could perhaps add to these the impact of non-verbal popularising media at this time, such as illustrations, things like a Dante calendar, a Dante map, and educational aids of the late 19th century, such as those lantern slides, and the educational ventures and pretensions of early cinema, including, of course, the Milano films 1911, which publicized itself in those very terms. But that is maybe to go somewhat beyond influence, and I think it is now more than time to let Federica speak for herself about her project, and I'll hand over now to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks so much for capturing so well in your response what I've been trying to do with my work since my doctoral days, and it's truly an honor for me to know that the book has met your interest in more than one way. Before starting to discuss the book, and I would like to thank all those who have been involved in helping me develop my initial thoughts, were very initial thoughts of a graduate, of a Sapienza graduate back in 2014, into a doctoral project, into a postdoctoral project that then led to this physical book, which is lovely to hold in my hands, truly. And so I would like to thank the IRC for granting me the support for really developing my thesis into this monograph, for allowing me time and headspace to really think about what I had done in my doctoral dissertation and how to transform it into something that would resonate with a wider public, that could be used as a stepping stone into a different direction into Dante reception studies and reception studies more generally, which have been, in my opinion, slightly too much tied to instances of creative response, without acknowledging that beyond and behind that creative response, there was a readerly endeavor. There was a moment in which every single great poet, from T.S. Eliot to Ezra Pound to Virginia Woolf, to all the great modernists who have brought Dante, who have revived Dante for the modern public, there was a moment of reading, of annotating, of thinking about the text they had they had in front of them, and that the very specific nature, material nature of the text they had in front of them influenced them, and also was part of a different movement of transformation of Dante into a commodity, into an Anglophone commodity, and an Anglophone text through the use of multiple material elements that ultimately ensured its survival through the ages. And for this interest into the material, into the material aspect of reception, I truly owe to Guy Armstrong, because she really made me think about the book that I had in front of me while I was working, and thinking about how the 19th century public, the Victorian public, was handling it first and foremost, And similarly to Daniela Gazelli, I know the fact that I was able to actually access the John Rylands Library. I spent long time, long hours, long days, deep down into the belly of the John Rylands Library in Manchester, going through these books and realizing the many were annotated, the many bore the traces of their owners, of those who gifted them eventually to the Rylands after the opening, but also of Enriqueta Rylands herself. So it made me think about collecting practices, writing practices, annotating practices that eventually fed into this book. So I'm truly indebted to all of them for this. Yes, Dante Beyond Influence, and the title as well, I think, if I remember correctly, was inspired by Gaida, that I think is here with us today, was an attempt to go beyond what has been said and done on Dante, and this meant also searching the marginal. Initially, my work was titled Marginal Dantismo, and I still stand by that choice, because also, along with looking at the creative dimension, we are also our attention is most of the time taken by the grand figures, those grand readers of Dante. But actually, what happened in the 19th century is that the greater popularization was done by what we would call minor figures that are not so well preserved or have been ignored by this historiographical record, And so using the archive, using personal correspondence, using a range of papers that are beyond the published one, helps us retrace this part of our history. Because as Dante's scholars, I have here a room full of them, we are indebted to that generation. But that generation did not live only in the lives of few great figures. It also lived in the lives of many men and women who were disseminating and teaching students of different classes, because, for instance, Philip Wicksteed was, and the extension movement that you were mentioning before, and Mrs. Paul Chapman, they were teaching Dante to middle and working class public, most of which my research have shown to have been women. So, and very few of them had the kind of privilege I have now of teaching and researching Dante as a profession. So my work was also, and my current work as well, is kind of archaeology, digs into the archaeology of my own discipline and my own field of studies, also to understand it better and open a different horizon into what has already been done. So thank you very much again for your response, and I'm very happy that you also mentioned Maria Francesca Rossetti and the Rossettis and all the women that I have purposefully decided not to discuss too extensively into a book. I wanted to give a proper treatment to the Rossetti sisters in one single chapter and leave the rest for a new research, because I truly think that they deserve wider space, and also I think that they deserve to be read and seen within a broader transnational perspective, because yes, the British dimension was dominant, but the Irish female readers were there, and they were active, and they were concerned with Dante in multiple ways. And also Italian women of the 19th century, of the Risorgimento, did so much to build the field of Dante studies in Italy. And their role has not been acknowledged so far. So I think that they need to be rediscovered, because we are kind of their legacy as well. So that was my reasoning for that.
Ben.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Welcome, Federica. We are truly delighted for you, and Nick, thanks a million for giving such an eloquent aperture into this book, which is retailing now in all good bookstores, I presume. And I just want to say, you know, having a copy of it myself, it's also a wonderful physical object. We're talking about material culture. Manchester University Press have done a wonderful job with this book, and they are to be congratulated as well. Now, we are in a few moments going to whisk Federica away, because we've set up a wine reception for her, and our apologies to all of you following us online that we cannot share the wine with you, and we wish we could, but sadly we're going to have to deal with it ourselves. But if there's anybody who'd like to just send a message or make a quick comment, please feel free to come in now, and if you want to say anything. Okay. Oh, Nick wants to say one more thing, yeah.
And I'm very sorry not to be able to join you for a drink, but in lieu of that, I wonder if I could make a little presentation to Federica. I was beguiled by Diego Salia into contributing to a kind of picture book on Byron and Dante recently, which has this cover. And as I have a free copy of it, I wondered if I could present it or send, if Federica will send me her postal address, I will send her a copy.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
It includes an essay by me on a woman reader of Dante. In other words, it was a kind of updating of Francis Kemble, of the material I wrote on Francis Kemble and Byron and Dante.
Oh, that would be lovely. Thank you very much.
But anyway, cheers, and I hope all the best.
And nobody else wants to intervene in any way? Just a couple of messages coming in on the chat, and we will say them. Okay, folks, that wraps it up for this evening. Thank you all for coming out and joining us online. As I said, we're going to go to our wine reception now, but please, stay tuned for further events from the Centre of Dante Studies here in Ireland. We have one coming up as ever. We also have one in our up our sleeve, and the next one is happening on the 28th of March, and that is called Social Media Dante, and that's going to be organized and mediated by Dario Galassini. So stay tuned for that, and we will let you know. So that's it, folks. There's Gaida. Great to see you. Well done.
Hi.
Your work. And Nick, thank you very much, and thanks very much, everybody. And just one more round of applause for Federica, please.
For coming. I see many familiar faces. Hi, Kristen. Hi, Gaida. Oh, hi, Karina. Hi. Hi, Vero.
Right, I am now going to stop this recording.